Loud music filled the room, echoing through crystal glasses and scattered laughter. The lights danced on the faces of everyone present, reflecting a joy that must have been genuine. I entered the party with the confidence of someone who knew their place. After all, it wasn't just anyone who could walk in there with their head held high, aware of their importance in the structure of that company. But something seemed out of place. A buzz near the dance floor caught my attention. My heart raced before I even understood why. That's when I saw them. In the middle of the crowd, under the lights that swirled with vibrant colors, there was my wife. Dancing. Laughing. And with him. The way their bodies moved, the indecent closeness, her mischievous smile. It was impossible not to notice the connection that transcended any innocent explanation. My body froze. Sweat began to form on my forehead, but the chill inside me was impossible to ignore. As I approached, I felt the eyes of a few people following me, sensing the impending storm before I could even articulate it. Each step seemed to weigh tons, but I pushed on. I needed to take a closer look, to confirm what my instincts were already screaming. It wasn't just a coincidence, a misunderstanding, or an innocent mistake. When I finally stopped next to the dance floor, the joy in her eyes turned to panic. She saw me. He saw me. It was a moment frozen in time, where the truth was laid bare before everyone. The smile disappeared from her lips, replaced by an expression of pure terror. "How could you?" My voice sounded firm but low. I didn't need to shout, each word carried enough weight to fill the entire hall. She tried to mumble something, but the words wouldn't come out. He, for his part, looked around like a cornered animal, searching for a way out that didn't exist. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, raising my voice enough to silence the music and attract everyone's attention. "I have an important announcement to make." Every eye was now fixed on me as I maintained control, even though my world was falling apart inside. As of today, I'm free. Free from lies, from betrayal, and from those who didn't know how to value what they had. I'm getting a divorce. The last word echoed in the tense silence, an unexpected blow to the festive atmosphere. Shock spread through the faces around me. Some whispered, others looked directly at them, waiting for the reaction that never came. They were motionless, unable to disguise their guilt. I turned and left without looking back, but I knew that this was just the start of something much bigger. As I left the party, I felt a mixture of anger and relief. The relief, however, was superficial, overshadowed by the acute pain of betrayal. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the car, adrenaline still pulsing through my veins. The image of them together, laughing as if I were irrelevant, was engraved in my mind like a red-hot iron. On the way home, my mind spiraled, alternating between happy memories and the brutal reality of the present. How many times had I blindly trusted her? How many nights did I turn working, believing that we were building something together? And for what? To be humiliated so publicly, so deliberately. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about respect, about loyalty, about principles that had been thrown away. And not just for her, but also for him. A colleague. Someone who had the audacity to look me in the eye during working hours and pretend that nothing was wrong. I got home and sat in the dark living room, looking at the emptiness around me. Memories of simpler times, when everything seemed genuine, came flooding back, bringing with them a deep pain. Why? I whispered into the silence, but I knew I would never have an answer that would suffice. The next few days were a blur of difficult conversations and inevitable decisions. Her every word seemed like a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "It's not what you think," she tried to say, but her voice was shaking. I interrupted her, unable to listen to any more excuses. "Do you think an explanation will erase the image of the two of you together? Do you think an explanation will change the fact that you betrayed me so blatantly?" My words cut like knives, but the pain I felt was 1,000 times worse. What I didn't expect, however, was that the consequences would go far beyond the two of us. The truth began to spread through the company like wildfire. He, the lover, began to feel the weight of social disapproval. Colleagues avoided him, looks of contempt followed him wherever he went. The confidence that had once placed him in strategic positions began to evaporate. And she, now an easy target for people's cruelty, also saw her image crumble. But something was about to happen. Something I hadn't seen coming. A twist so intense that it would make everything that happened at the party seem small. Their betrayal was just the start of a chain of events that would change all our lives forever. And that's where it gets even more interesting. What began as a devastating night turns into something no one could have imagined. The question that plagued me was no longer, why did this happen, but rather, how far will it go? Welcome to the channel. Here, we repudiate any kind of betrayal and explore, through fictional stories, how disloyalty can devastate lives and relationships. Our mission is to show the profound impact that these choices can have, bringing valuable lessons about loyalty, respect, and the consequences of our actions. Get ready, because you're about to hear a shocking story full of twists and turns. Good story. It was an ordinary morning at the home of Daniel and Laura, a couple who seemed, in the eyes of many, to have a perfect life. Married for 10 years, they were known among friends and family as the kind of couple everyone admired, successful, devoted and seemingly in love. Daniel, an ambitious and detail-oriented executive, had always been the kind of man who planned every step with precision. Laura, on the other hand, was his emotional counterpart, a creative and charismatic woman with a smile that lit up any room. While he busied himself with reports and endless meetings, she filled her days with artistic projects, running her small gallery and creating works that conveyed a unique sensibility. Despite the differences in their personalities, Daniel and Laura shared a deep connection. Their moments together, although increasingly rare due to the demands of life, were filled with long conversations, spontaneous laughter and memories that seemed unbreakable. Daniel loved how Laura would make little surprises, like leaving affectionate notes in his pocket or preparing his favorite dessert after a hard day. She, in turn, admired Daniel's determination, his ability to remain calm even in the most challenging situations. The routine, however, was beginning to show its claws. Work took up most of Daniel's time, and Laura was increasingly occupied with the gallery, trying to fulfill a dream she had nurtured since college. When they met in the evenings, their conversations were quick and often practical. They talked about bills, appointments and future plans, but there was an invisible gap that they both seemed to avoid. It wasn't blatant, but it was there, like a background noise that bothered them in silence. Laura missed what it was like in the beginning. She remembered the lazy weekends when they both decided to escape the city to explore unknown destinations, just the two of them. When did everything become so predictable, she would sometimes think, while tidying up the house or finishing another painting. Daniel, on the other hand, carried a different weight. He felt responsible for maintaining the standard of living they had achieved together, but this took him away from what really mattered, being present. He wanted to be more than just a provider, he wanted to be the man who made Laura laugh until she cried, who made her feel loved, wanted. Still, they carried on. They did what was expected, attended Daniel's company parties, organized dinners for friends at home, and spent Sundays with their families. At first glance, they seemed happy. And perhaps, at times, they really were. Laura's gallery was their refuge. The small but welcoming place was an extension of her personality. White walls served as a canvas for vibrant works full of life, which contrasted with the often monotonous rhythm of her reality. Customers came and went, leaving compliments and promises to return. For her, each sale was more than a transaction, it was validation of her passion. One of her colleagues, Sophia, always said, "Laura, your art has soul. It's impossible not to be touched." Daniel, on the other hand, was immersed in a completely different world. His company was growing rapidly, and he found himself under increasing pressure to meet demands that seemed unending. The company parties were a mixture of relief and obligation, an opportunity to relax, but also to keep up appearances. He knew how much Laura hated these events, but she always appeared at his side, impeccable, with that smile that masked how much she would rather be at home. Party nights were always a peculiar scene. Daniel watched how his colleagues interacted, how every conversation seemed to be calculated, a game of appearances. Laura, on the other hand, stood out. No matter where she was, she attracted glances, not because she was pretentious, but because she was genuine. This made Daniel feel proud and, at the same time, insecure. He knew Laura was special, someone who couldn't be defined by social conventions or the predictable routine they had built up. A month before the company party, something changed. It was a random evening and they were both in the living room, each immersed in their own tasks. Daniel was revising a report on his laptop, while Laura was making notes in her art journal. The silence between them was not unusual, but this time it seemed heavier. Daniel looked at Laura for a moment, noticing the small lines on her face that hadn't been there before. He felt a pang of guilt, as if he were responsible for each one of them. "Laura, are you all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised by the question. I'm fine, just a bit tired, maybe. I know I've been absent. I promise things will get better. I'm trying to close a big project, and when that happens, we'll take a vacation, just the two of us." Laura smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I know you're doing your best, Daniel. Just, don't forget that we don't need anything big. We just need time." Daniel nodded, but the conversation hung in the air, with no real conclusion. They both returned to their tasks, but that exchange of words would remain etched in their minds. On the day of the party, Laura spent hours getting ready. She chose a dress she knew Daniel loved, and put on the perfume he always said was his favorite. When he saw her ready, he couldn't help but smile. "You look beautiful," he said, as he helped her put on her coat. "Thank you. Let's make this quick, okay?" she replied, her tone light but revealing a little of her reluctance. "I promise we won't stay long," Daniel assured her, squeezing her hand before they left. The party was grand, as always. The hall was decorated with an almost oppressive luxury, and the conversations were a constant hum of mixed voices. Daniel moved around the room like a conductor, greeting colleagues and bosses with the formality that the moment demanded. Laura, for her part, was there, but she wasn't. Her gaze wandered around the lights, the people, as if searching for something she herself didn't know what it was. Daniel noticed, but chose not to comment. There was something about Laura that he couldn't decipher. Perhaps it was tiredness, perhaps it was deeper. He convinced himself that he could sort it out later, that the vacation he had promised would be enough to reconnect the two of them. As the night wore on, a turning point was approaching. Something that would change everything they knew, that would turn that apparent stability into a minefield of revelations and consequences. They didn't know it yet, but what was about to happen would call into question everything they had built together. And deep down, Laura and Daniel felt, even if they didn't want to admit it, that this party would be a milestone in their lives. They just couldn't imagine how. The party had already reached its climax. The hall, filled with voices and laughter, echoed a rhythm of celebration that contrasted with the growing tension Daniel felt. He circulated among the guests, exchanging greetings and formal conversations, but his attention seemed fragmented, always returning to Laura. From afar, he watched her, elegant as ever, but with a different gleam in his eye. Something didn't seem right. She was smiling, interacting with other people, but there was a subtle disconnect in her movements, as if her mind was elsewhere. For a moment, he tried to push the thoughts away, convincing himself that it was just paranoia. Laura had always been a free-spirited woman, and he knew that company parties were not her favorite environment. Still, there was something he couldn't ignore. A nagging intuition that refused to go away. Laura, for her part, moved around the room with the grace of someone used to being watched. She knew exactly how to behave in such an environment, even though she preferred the tranquility of her gallery. But that night, there was something that made her feel out of place. She avoided Daniel's lingering glances, feeling his presence like an invisible weight. Every time she saw him from a distance, her heart raced, not out of love, but out of a mixture of guilt and anxiety that she couldn't control. While Daniel was dragged into endless conversations with his colleagues and superiors, Laura found herself increasingly isolated in her own thoughts. She held a glass of champagne with steady fingers, but inside she felt on the verge of collapse. Every laugh and every polite gesture seemed like a monumental effort. The truth she carried inside her was like a time bomb, about to explode. That's when he appeared. At first, Laura tried to avoid crossing her eyes, but it was impossible. He approached her with the naturalness of someone who knew she wouldn't resist. The words they exchanged were brief, almost inaudible, but loaded with meaning that needed no explanation. He smiled, a smile that mixed complicity and defiance. Laura looked away for a moment, trying to resist the magnetic force of that presence. "Are you all right?" he asked, in a low, intimate tone, as he leaned slightly towards her. "I am," Laura replied, but her voice was more fragile than she would have liked. "Are you sure? You look nervous." She forced a smile and shook her head, trying to dissipate the tension. But his gaze was like a blade, cutting through any attempt at pretense. They knew they were being reckless, but that seemed to be part of what attracted them. The risk, the possibility of being discovered, made everything seem more intense. Daniel, on the other side of the hall, finished his conversation with one of the directors and, as he looked again in the direction Laura was facing, he realized that she had disappeared. His eyes scanned the room, but she was no longer there. He tried to calm down, but his anxiety was growing by the second. He grabbed a glass of wine from a passing waiter and tried to distract himself, but an inner voice urged him to go and find her. Laura and her companion had discreetly gone out into the party garden. There, away from the bright lights and watchful eyes, they could finally breathe. The fresh night air seemed to ease the tension, but only for a moment. He moved closer, and Laura didn't flinch. The next few minutes were filled with quick words, restrained gestures, but loaded with meaning that neither of them could ignore. "You know this is dangerous," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "And that's what makes it interesting, isn't it?" he replied, his tone a mixture of charm and teasing. Laura looked away again, but this time she couldn't hide her feelings. His eyes reflected a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, desire, confusion. He raised his hand and lightly touched her face, a gesture that made her close her eyes for a moment, as if to escape reality. It was at that moment that Daniel went out into the garden, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel was enough to alert them. Laura took a step back, moving away quickly, but it was too late. When Daniel saw them together, the world around them seemed to stop. The expression on Daniel's face changed from surprise to disbelief and finally to a devastating mixture of anger and pain. He didn't need to hear words, he didn't need explanations. The scene before him spoke for itself. Laura tried to say something, but her voice wouldn't come out. The silence was deafening, each second longer than the last. Daniel stepped forward, staring at the two of them. His gaze, once warm and welcoming, was now cold and penetrating. "Is this serious?" he asked, his voice laden with an uneasy calm that made each word weigh like a sentence. Laura remained silent, unable to formulate any response that might alleviate the situation. The man next to her tried to intervene, but Daniel held up his hand, silencing him before he could speak. "I think I've seen enough," said Daniel, turning and walking away without looking back. He walked quickly out of the garden, leaving Laura and her companion paralyzed, trapped in a moment that seemed to drag on indefinitely. Back in the lounge, Daniel tried to compose himself. He knew he couldn't cause a scene there, not at that moment. But his mind was racing, each thought more chaotic than the last. He grabbed his jacket and, before leaving, looked back one last time, as if he wanted to record every detail of that night in his memory. Laura, still in the garden, felt the weight of her choices falling on her like an avalanche. She knew that what she had done was unforgivable, but she also knew that she had yet to face the worst. Daniel's silence was just the prelude to a storm that was about to descend on them all. Daniel didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly, while thoughts swirled around his mind like a hurricane. Laura's betrayal was an open wound, but her silence, her inability to explain or even apologize, was a weight he couldn't bear. The man he had seen with her, a face Daniel vaguely recognized as someone from the company, only intensified the humiliation. He parked his car in front of a cheap hotel, walked in without looking around and booked a room. He climbed the stairs with heavy steps, each accompanied by a silent blow of despair and anger. Meanwhile, Laura was sitting on the sofa in the living room, staring at the emptiness. The house, which used to be a refuge, now seemed like a prison. She knew Daniel wasn't coming back that night. The image of his face meeting them in the garden remained etched in her mind. The mixture of pain and disappointment was more devastating than any scream could have been. She picked up the phone several times, but couldn't dial. What would she say? How would she explain something that she herself barely understood? The next day, Daniel finally came home. He entered quietly, his face tired, but with a quiet determination that Laura immediately recognized as a sign that the situation had reached an irreversible point. She was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of cold coffee, when she heard the door close. He entered the kitchen and stared at her, his eyes carrying a coldness she had never seen before. "We need to talk," he said bluntly. Laura nodded, but couldn't find the words. They sat at the table, facing each other, like strangers. The silence was almost unbearable, until Daniel broke it. "How long has it been?" he asked, his voice low but firm. She hesitated, trying to gauge the impact of his answer before she even said it. "A few months," he finally replied, his voice shaking. Daniel shook his head slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Why?" Laura took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. I don't know. It was a mistake, Daniel. I was confused. We were so far apart. Distant. He repeated, almost mockingly. And that was your solution? To betray the man who supported you through everything, who sacrificed so much for you? It wasn't like that, she replied, her voice rising slightly with the weight of emotion. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, he retorted, looking straight into her eyes. It hurt in a way you'll never understand. Laura felt tears start to run down her face, but Daniel didn't look away. There was more. He knew there was something more. His intuition, which he had always ignored, was now pulsing like an alarm. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for a bigger blow. There's something you're not telling me, he said, with frightening calm. And I want to know now. Laura lowered her eyes, unable to support him. For a moment, the silence lengthened, and Daniel almost thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in an almost inaudible voice, she said, he used my access to the company. Daniel frowned, confused. What are you saying? He needed information, about contracts, clients. He convinced me he was harmless, just to help him with some business. I let him use my password. The words hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. He stood up abruptly, the chair dragging with a clattering noise. Are you saying he used you to steal confidential company information? Laura couldn't answer, she just nodded slowly, her expression tinged with embarrassment. Daniel began to pace back and forth, trying to process what he had just heard. Do you have any idea what that means? He asked, almost shouting. You've put your career, my career, at risk. That's a crime, Laura. You've been involved in something much bigger than a simple case. I didn't know he'd do something like that, she replied, her voice full of despair. I just wanted to help. He promised me it was nothing serious. And you believed him, Daniel said, the incredulity in his voice being replaced by a growing anger. You believed him more than you believed me. Laura was crying openly now, but Daniel no longer had the energy to console her. He took the car keys and left, leaving her alone in the kitchen, steeped in regret. Daniel drove straight to the company, where he asked for an immediate meeting with the security director. He knew that any hesitation could cost him his own credibility. During the meeting, he explained the situation, omitting personal details but making it clear that sensitive information had been compromised. The security team promised to investigate immediately, and Daniel knew that this meant exposing Laura and the man she had become involved with. As he awaited the investigation's conclusions, Daniel felt a mixture of emotions. Laura's betrayal was personal, but now there was a professional component that made everything even more complex. He knew that his reputation was at stake, and that was something he wasn't willing to sacrifice. Days later, the bomb exploded. The investigation revealed that Laura's lover had used the information obtained to close side deals for his own benefit, directly damaging the company. He was fired immediately, and legal proceedings were launched. Laura, although indirectly involved, would also face serious consequences. Daniel knew that this was only the beginning of a long battle. When he returned home that evening, he found Laura sitting in the same place, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him, but didn't say anything. Daniel sat down in the chair opposite her, and for a moment they were silent, as if they were trying to measure the depth of the chasm that separated them. "I've done what needed to be done," he finally said. "Now you'll have to face the consequences." Laura nodded, but the pain in her eyes was evident. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to lose you." Daniel sighed, running his hands over his face. "You didn't just lose me, Laura. You lost our trust, our future. And that's something we may never get back." Silence filled the room again, heavy and oppressive. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same. And as Daniel got up to leave again, Laura realized that the man she loved had turned into someone she barely recognized, not because of him, but because of the choices she herself had made. Daniel didn't come back to work the next day. He felt emotionally drained, as if every fiber of his being was struggling to pull itself together. He needed time to reflect, but he also knew that the clock was ticking. Laura's actions and the consequences that now hung over them had created an irreparable divide, but there was much more at stake than just their relationship. He spent the morning sitting in the living room, staring at the dim light coming through the blinds, while his mind alternated between the past and the chaos of the present. Laura didn't dare go downstairs. Ever since their conversation the night before, she had avoided Daniel, as if fearing that her presence would only increase his anger. The silence between them had become an entity of its own, filling the house with a suffocating tension. When she finally gathered her courage, she walked slowly down the stairs, finding Daniel still sitting in the same position. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant, almost inaudible. Daniel raised his eyes slowly. There was an exhaustion in them that made her cringe internally, but he nodded. "Speak." She approached and sat down on the opposite sofa, keeping a distance that seemed unbearable. "I know that apologies aren't enough, but I need you to understand. I was lost. It's not a justification, but I didn't know how to deal with my feelings anymore. You were so distant, so busy, and I was weak." Daniel watched her in silence, his fingers intertwined in a gesture of restraint. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but charged with emotion. "You weren't lost, Laura. You made a decision. You chose to ignore everything we'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for us, for something you knew was wrong." His words hit Laura like a blow, but she knew she deserved every one of them. "I know," she replied, her voice breaking. "I know how wrong I was. But please, let me try to make it right. Somehow." Daniel shook his head, bitterness taking over his expression. "Do you think it can be fixed? It's not just about what you did to me, Laura. It's about what you did to yourself, to our life, to what we had. I don't know if I can look at you without remembering. The two were silent for a moment, until Daniel stood up abruptly. "I need to leave. Staying here. I can't." Laura wanted to stop him, but she knew she didn't have the right. She just watched him walk out the door, feeling the crushing weight of his choices. Daniel drove to a park where he used to go when he needed clarity. Sitting on a bench, he observed the movement of the people around him, the children playing, the couples chatting quietly. Everything seemed so normal, so far removed from his current reality. He felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket and, when he checked it, he saw a message from the company's security director. Laura's lover had been arrested that morning, after more evidence had come to light. Daniel read the message with grim satisfaction. Part of him wanted to feel that this was justice, but another part just felt more tired. As he gazed at the horizon, a familiar voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "You look lost," said a woman, taking a seat next to him. It was Maria, a work colleague he had known for years, but with whom he rarely spoke outside of work. She had a gentle smile and eyes that conveyed an unexpected calm. "Maybe I am," Daniel replied, without the energy to disguise it. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. But then, as if a dam had broken, he began to talk. He told her everything, from Laura's betrayal to the consequences for the company and the unbearable weight of everything that was happening. Maria listened in silence, occasionally nodding, but never interrupting. When he had finished, she remained silent for a moment before speaking. "You're right to be angry, Daniel. But you know what I see. A man who is still here, trying to understand, trying to cope. That's not weakness. It's strength." Her words surprised him. He had never thought of his struggle in this way. They spent some more time talking, and Maria made him feel, for the first time in days, that maybe there was a way out of his pain. Back at the house, Laura was in her bedroom, staring at an open suitcase on the bed. She knew it was only a matter of time before Daniel asked her to leave. Maybe it was the right thing to do. But every object she put in the suitcase was like a piece of herself being ripped out. She felt shattered, not knowing how or if she would ever be able to put herself back together. Daniel arrived late, later than usual. When he entered the room, he saw Laura standing by her suitcase. He stood still for a moment, as if deciding what to say. "Are you leaving?" he finally asked. Laura looked at him, tears in her eyes. "I thought you wanted me to go." Daniel sighed deeply. "I don't know what I want, Laura. But I know we can't go on like this." She nodded, holding back the tears. I want you to know that I've never stopped loving you." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if to block out the words. "Love isn't enough, Laura. Not after all this." The conversation ended there, and Daniel left the room, leaving Laura alone with her pain. Over the next few days, their interactions became increasingly scarce. Laura finally left the house, and Daniel immersed himself in his work, trying to fill the void she had left. But even with the physical distance, they both knew that they were still bound by the weight of what had happened. And despite everything, Daniel began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was something beyond the pain. Something he wasn't yet ready to face, but which was there, waiting for him on the horizon. The silence in the house that had once been home to Daniel and Laura's laughter and conversation was now a constant, almost oppressive presence. Laura had left, taking with her more than just her belongings. She left a void that Daniel didn't know how to fill. Yet he didn't give in to the temptation to wallow in mourning for what he had lost. He decided to focus on what he could control, his career, his reputation and, most importantly, his own sanity. At work, Daniel became more reserved. He was known for being a determined leader, someone who dealt with crises calmly and efficiently, but now his stance carried additional weight. Rumors of betrayal, although not officially discussed, circulated like shadows in the corridors. No one dared broach the subject directly, but looks of sympathy and interrupted conversations when entering a room were inevitable. Daniel ignored it. Not out of pride, but because he knew that any display of fragility would be seen as weakness. The arrest of Laura's lover had become a turning point, but not a closure. The investigation revealed the extent of the damage done, both to the company and to Daniel's trust in the systems he himself had helped to build. It was a double betrayal, personal and professional. He spent days reviewing reports, trying to minimize losses and shield the organization from future threats. It gave him a sense of purpose, but also kept him on the edge of his own pain. One evening, while reviewing documents in his home office, Maria called. Her voice, always serene, brought a kind of comfort he didn't know he needed. "I'm sorry to call so late," she began, hesitantly. "But I've noticed that you've been working too much. Is everything all right?" Daniel sighed, looking at the pile of papers in front of him. Defining "all right" seems like an impossible task at the moment. "Then maybe you need a break," she suggested. "Let's go for coffee tomorrow. No work, no obligations. Just a break." He hesitated. The idea seemed both tempting and out of place. But finally, he agreed. "Early tomorrow morning. Before I change my mind." The next day, they met in a discreet café, far from the usual hustle and bustle. Maria was an easy presence, someone who knew how to fill the silence without making it uncomfortable. They talked about everything except Laura. She made him laugh with stories from work, reminding him that there were still light moments to be enjoyed, even in the midst of the storm. Meanwhile, Laura was in a small rented apartment, trying to rebuild the pieces of herself. She spent her days immersed in her art, but even that felt empty. Isolation didn't heal her, it only amplified her guilt. She rehearsed messages for Daniel, but never sent them. What could she say that hadn't already been said? That she still loved him. That she wanted a second chance. Those words seemed so insignificant in the face of what she had done. One afternoon, while walking through the park near her apartment, she ran into Sophia, her colleague from the gallery. Sophia knew enough about the situation to realize that Laura wasn't well, but she avoided judgment. "You can't live like this, Laura," said Sophia, with a gentle but firm tone. "You're stuck in what you've lost. Maybe it's time to think about what you can still build." The words kept echoing in Laura's mind, but the idea of starting over seemed as distant as the possibility of Daniel forgiving her. Nevertheless, she began to make small changes. She resumed old contacts, signed up for smaller exhibitions and, little by little, felt a spark of purpose returning. Daniel, for his part, was at a crossroads. Conversations with Maria became more frequent, but he still had an emotional barrier. She never pushed, but it was clear that there was something more between them, something he didn't know how or if he should explore. In one of these conversations, Maria made an observation that stuck with him. "Sometimes we need to leave the past behind to see what's right in front of us," she said, her eyes fixed on his. Daniel was silent, processing the words. He knew he was still stuck with Laura, not for the betrayal itself, but for what it represented, an important chapter in his life that now seemed unfinished. One evening, while reviewing documents once again, Daniel received an unexpected message from Laura. She wasn't apologizing, she wasn't begging for forgiveness. It was just a request to talk, to clarify something she felt he needed to know. The next day, they met in a cafe near her apartment. Laura seemed different, calmer, but also more fragile. Daniel, on the other hand, was cautious, keeping an emotional distance that he knew was necessary. "Why did you call me here?" he asked bluntly. Laura took a deep breath before answering. "I needed to thank you. For everything. Even after everything that happened, you were fair to me. I know I didn't deserve it." Daniel remained silent, waiting for her to get to the point. "And I needed to tell you. I finally understood how much I lost myself. Not just in what happened between us, but in myself. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. Not to win you back, but because I need it for myself." Her words, although sincere, didn't bring immediate relief. But something about them resonated with Daniel. He realized that Laura was finally taking on the responsibility he had always wanted her to take on. When the conversation ended, Daniel left with mixed emotions. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but something inside him felt a little lighter. Perhaps it was the start of something new, or just the end of something old. He still didn't know. And that, for now, was enough. The months that followed brought profound changes for everyone involved. Daniel, who had previously hidden behind work and avoided confronting his own feelings, finally allowed the cracks to become visible. He realized that there was no escaping the weight of what he had experienced with Laura, but he also understood that remaining stuck in the pain would be a choice. It was time to start again, but on his own terms. His relationship with Maria grew in an unexpected way. It wasn't immediate, nor was it linear. Maria respected Daniel's rhythm, and that made all the difference. She didn't try to fill the void left by Laura, but offered a constant, calm presence. Daniel began to find joy in small moments again, a walk in the park, an impromptu dinner, a chat at the end of a tiring day. For the first time in a long time, he felt there was room for something new. Laura, for her part, continued to rebuild her life. Her art took on a deeper, more honest tone, reflecting the inner turmoil she was experiencing. Participating in smaller exhibitions connected her with people who saw value in what she did, and this brought a validation that didn't depend on anyone but herself. There was still regret, a pain that arose at unexpected moments, but Laura was beginning to understand that forgiving herself was the only way forward. One silent evening, while finishing a painting, she realized she was crying. Not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time, she felt she could go on. Daniel and Laura didn't keep in touch after their last meeting. There was a mutual understanding that going their separate ways was best for both of them. Even so, Daniel was surprised to receive a letter from her. No drama, no requests for reconciliation, just a simple and sincere message. "Daniel, thank you for being such an important part of my life. I'll never be able to undo what I've done, but I'll always treasure what we've built as something special. I wish you the happiness you deserve. Laura." He read the letter several times before putting it away in a drawer. He didn't know if he had completely forgiven her, but he knew he didn't hate her. That was enough. At the company, things also took a different turn. The impact of the scandal was absorbed, and the measures Daniel had taken to strengthen the organization's security were praised. He rebuilt his credibility with effort and transparency, turning what could have been a fatal blow into an opportunity for renewal. As for Laura's lover, the consequences were inevitable. As well as facing criminal charges, he became a social and professional pariah. The choices he had made not only ruined his career, but also isolated him from the people who trusted him. The weight of his actions sooner or later took its toll. A year after the end of their marriage, Daniel and Maria traveled together for the first time. It wasn't a big trip, just a weekend in a quiet place, but it was enough for him to realize that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. One sunny afternoon, sitting next to her, Daniel smiled for the first time in a long time, a genuine, unreserved smile. Laura, in a smaller gallery where his works were on display, heard a visitor comment, "There's something so honest about this painting. It's as if you feel the story behind it." And for the first time, she responded with a real smile. It was no longer a search for approval, but an acceptance of who she was and what she had become. Daniel and Laura's stories took different paths, but they both found ways to move forward. It wasn't a return to what was before, but a move towards what could be. And, in the end, maybe that's what mattered. Now it's up to you, what did you think of this story? We want to know what you think, so leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this one. Here, we show how betrayal can destroy lives and learn from these fictional but profound lessons. This channel does not endorse any form of betrayal, and we hope that these stories inspire reflection on choices and consequences. See you next time.